I may yell for you if I hadn't PowerPoint review for me.
Again, let me say a word of thanks to the CTNS staff who have been responsible for producing this wonderful event and shepherding us through the day. So thanks to Bonnie, Melissa, and Josh. Thank you very much for your help. Let me also say that many of Cynthia's books are available in the G2 bookstore, and if you don't know where that is, it's 2465 Lacan, sort of right up this street past BSR, and they're open today. So if you want to take some time during lunch, that would be perfect to go up there and get yourself some copies of some of her works.
And we have maps of the area right out there.
Thanks, Bonnie. It's a real pleasure to introduce the first of our two morning respondents. We'll each have 15 minutes, and we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A, so it'll be an hour before lunch. But it's a genuine pleasure to introduce the first respondent, who really needs no introduction, he's so well known. Dr. Mark Bekoff is former professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Colorado. Mark is a fellow of the Animal Behavior Society and a former Guggenheim Fellow. His most recent book is The Emotional Lives of Animals. A leading scientist explores animal joy, sorrow, and empathy, and why they matter. And I believe there are copies of the book out in the foyer as well, so you can look at that. Mark is a member of our scientist participant in our Science and Spiritual Quest project, which, as I was saying about the mission of CTNS, carries out really its public service of bringing distinguished scientists to the foreground who are interested in talking about the positive relation between science and faith, science and spiritual experience. And it's a pleasure to have him here today and to talk to us about this issue of how we can talk about the moral dimension or the latent dimension of moral behavior in animals. And I think he has an exciting brief video for us. So please join me in welcoming Mark Bekoff.
I may go 2 minutes over if that's okay. But I did bring a watch. Great. Great. It's great to be here. I'm really on a different turf than I usually roam. So I'm just going to start off, and I'll be showing a slideshow, and I've got a video, and I'm going to argue, the bottom line, I'm going to argue that in certain venues, social context, animals can be moral beings, they know right from wrong. And I had the advantage, I just learned PowerPoint, so I can throw in some slides on the way. But you've probably already seen something like this. Somebody gave me this t-shirt, it's like, science rules. And I, of course, don't think science rules at all. It's one of the many different shows in town. But I like the t-shirt. And the other thing is I think that when animals read about what we write about them, we really need to be right on the mark. And so I'll cover some of this as I go through my talk. But in response to just some questions, and I'll just sail through this. This is why I'm going to beg you for 2 minutes. Is, do animals show compassion to one another? Do animals punish one another? Yeah, they do. This is a dog and a rhesus monkey in a shelter in Bangladesh, where the dog was abused and abandoned, the monkey was abused and abandoned. They became great friends. When they were apart, they chased one another down, they hug one another, they're inseparable. This just came out last week. A leopard and a baby baboon. This is in the wild. This isn't in some zoo where, leopards eat the baby baboons as appetizers. No. And this was just recent. A predatory snake and a hamster in a zoo in Tokyo. This snake befriended this particular female, and she would sit on his back as he ate other hamsters. So we see what I call these improbable relationships. There's a whole slew of them, and I write about a lot of them in my book. Oh, right. My book is out there. The reason I show this really is, of course, number one, you got to buy it. But number two, all of what I talk about today is in chapter 4 of my book, boiled down for a non-scientific audience. So I just thought I'd say that. And the other thing I'm going to say is we need to get into the field. I think last night Celia and Oliver and I and a former student of mine were talking, but it's really important to know what animals do. A lot of people, it's funny how so many people feel free to write about animals and animal behavior, and they've never studied them. They've never watched them. They've never gone into the field, or their experience is limited to watching animals in cages where they can't display the full panoply of behavior, the flexibility, the adaptability, the things that they do in the wild. So I caution that I would never try to write a paper on theology. So I think people who write about animal behavior should at least get out and watch animals and not come in with preconceived notions. Well, I'm going to sail through some slides because I really want to say quite a bit, but since I'm commenting directly and somewhat indirectly on Celia's paper, these are some of the questions I see that are raised, and I can share this afterwards with people, but is there evolutionary continuity? What is the nature of the human-non-human boundary? Are there different levels of selection? Do we need to concentrate only on individuals, or is there group selection? Is there a moral gap between humans and other animals? Do other animals have a moral sense? Can they be moral beings? Can they be evil? Do other animals atone? Do they forgive and forget? I had to look up, I had no idea what atonement meant in the formal sense. I think another message that may come through, and I hope it does, is that, yeah, animals can be evil, and animals do forgive and forget. And the other thing about the importance of watching animals is to watch what they do to one another, that they do forgive one another, and they will punish others in certain situations. They do that. Do animals have the cognitive and emotional capacities that are needed for morality? What's the taxonomic distribution of morality? Are primates special? I study carnivores, wolves, coyotes, dogs, foxes, and in fact there's a move now to move to the social carnivores to learn about the evolution of human behavior. Social carnivores are much more similar to our ancestors than are chimpanzees and gorillas. But there seems to be this primatocentrism that prevails, and there's really no reason if you want to be good comparative biologists. So what about anthropomorphism and science value for you? I mean, you know all this. And I'll talk a bit about my work on play behavior, how it fits in. And I just came across this because I was reading for something else, an article by John Hare, who really argues that there is not evolutionary continuity, that there really is a discontinuity or a gap, he calls it the moral gap between humans and other animals. And this is thoroughly speciesistic. It certainly puts humans on a pedestal, if you will, above other animals, and he ignores recent findings in cognitive ethology and social neuroscience. And so, go through that. Let me just make a really brief comment about anthropomorphism, and I'll be really happy to talk about this more later. We have to be anthropomorphic. There's no way we can't be. It's not a sin, it's not a disease, as some people say it is. I developed this notion of biocentric anthropomorphism, where we take the animal's point of view, but of course before you can take the animal's point of view, you've got to study them and watch them. And so I just say that. There's a recent study using MRIs that show that when we anthropomorphize, the same area of the brain lights up as during pleasure and emotion. We anthropomorphize because we feel. We attribute human characteristics to thunderstorms, angry weather patterns. So I think this is very important, that we anthropomorphize because we feel, and the neural basis of anthropomorphism supports that. And it's unavoidable, so let's just do it right. Let's not worry about whether we're doing something wrong. We can go to Darwin. First quote is, those communities which included the greatest number of most sympathetic members would flourish best. Some work by William Hornaday, also The Minds and Manners of Wild Animals. I'm writing a book now with Jessica Pierce, who's a philosopher, and I guess she has a degree in Masters of Divinity from Harvard. And we're talking about the evolution of moral behavior. I call it wild justice in animals. One big thing, too, is when I come to meetings like this, that science isn't value-free, and I kind of think we all thought the best bank was, the same bank was the best bank in town. We'd all put our money there. And we choose different beers, we choose different wines. And once again, I think it's because science isn't value-free. I'm not saying that as a criticism. We just come to the table with an agenda as individuals in the world. And I always say if science was value-free, then my critics would leave us alone. Leave me alone. A lot of my work falls upon the work of Nico Tinbergen, who won the Nobel Prize in ethology along with Konrad Lorenz and Karl von Frisch. And they won the Nobel Prize in the area called physiology or medicine, and it really angered the hardcore scientists, but they did get the Nobel Prize. And basically, Tinbergen laid out 4 questions that we should ask. Basically, how did a particular behavior pattern evolve? Why is it adaptive? How does it allow an animal to adapt to his or her environment? What causes the behavior pattern? And ontogeny, not ontology. How do these behavior patterns develop? In my field work on coyotes and wolves, when they emerge from the den at 14 or 18 days of age, you already see different personalities and different ways of viewing the world. So we're very interested in the development of individual differences in behavior. Celia mentioned this, I just inserted this one, because we need to pay attention to the way animals communicate with one another. Not only in vision, but using olfaction and audition. And there's just no doubt about the fact that if we concentrate only on vision, we're cutting out, in many animals, we're just cutting out almost totally the way they communicate with one another. So I bet you didn't know that bank voles who live on the River Thames in London have a play scent that's produced on the back of the neck. And if you take a swab of cotton and you take the play scent from the neck of one bank vole and you put it on the neck of another bank vole, you can get a non-playing bank vole to play. Pretty cool. So I think, these are important messages. Another message I'll just put out, and I'll show you some slides in video, is we can study animal emotions and animal cognition using objective criteria. So for example, if we say, do animals love one another? Well, of course they can love one another using the same criteria that we use. They travel with one another, they'll defend one another, they mate from year to year, they raise the young together. When they're apart, they miss one another, et cetera, et cetera. So we can actually collect quantitative data on this. It's not, some people think the study of animal minds and the study of mythology is just fluff compared to physics and chemistry, but the fact of the matter is we can go out into the field and study animals. It's not always pleasant. I mean, I've tracked coyotes when it's minus 60 below. I've studied penguins in Antarctica. It's not always fun. It loses its romanticism really fast. You go through tons of work-study students who say, oh, I couldn't imagine anything more fun than watching coyotes play until it's like 10 days later where they haven't seen a thing happen and they're ready to bail. But the fact of the matter is, if we do the work, we can learn a lot about their lives. I put this in because last night at dinner we were talking about whether animals have a sense of awe and wonder. Do they exclaim wow in their own way as they ponder nature and the ups and downs of daily life? I think they might. So why do I focus on social play? I focus on play behavior because play uses actions from different contexts. When animals play, they bite one another, they hip slam one another, they'll mount one another as if they're mating, and we need to get the message across that this is play, not aggression or predation or mating. And they need to be sure about this because if play escalates into aggression, it becomes very dangerous and they can get injured. It requires cooperation, fairness, ongoing negotiations. They have to apologize for biting too hard. They have to forgive. They have to trust that other animals will obey the rules of the game. They need to read others and other individuals' intentions and beliefs. In a sense, they have to have a theory of mind. And recent research on neuroneurons, which I can talk about later, supports the fact that animals other than humans have a neural basis for empathy and for sharing intentions. So it's really exciting to weave in the ethology and social neuroscience. And in order to play, animals will do a lot of things. They'll use play signals very strategically. Dominant animals allow themselves to be dominated only in play called role reversal. They'll self-handicap. They won't bite another animal as hard as they can or slam into another animal as hard as they can. And we've shown that sequences of animal play are very variable. and the animals read the sequences. They know that when they're preying on something or when they're being dominated, there's a very strict transition between one act to another. But when they play, it plays all over the place. It's highly variable. In fact, if you ask human beings about how they know if they're playing, they'll give you the same criteria. So you might as well attribute that to other animals. I'm not saying animals are always moral beings, and I'm not saying that predators are immoral. And once again, we can talk about that. That always comes up. What about the lion who kills a gazelle? Well, what about him? He's an evolved predator, and that's how he eats. So I want to be really clear. Even the work of Franz de Waal and the equity equation in Great Apes, Franz is not saying that animals are always, quote, moral, and neither are we. They're not always fair, neither are we. But from the fact that they are not always moral beings doesn't mean that they're not moral beings in certain instances. And I think that that's something that we need to pay attention to. So I'd like to show this, and then I can conclude. It's about a 4-minute video, and I hope it works. Uh-oh. You know what? I'm going to switch this. Okay. It's hard to hear, but basically what this will show is what animals do when they play and how they maintain the play mood and how easy it is for play to spill into aggression and how they need to have some sense of right and wrong. If I want to play with you, I can't bite you too hard. That would be wrong. And the question arises, well, do animals punish one another? Yes, if they play unfairly, we know in coyotes they get thrown out of their group and they suffer higher mortality. And this will show how dogs, one dog weighs 100 pounds and one weighs 20, how they play with one another. And this shows you how we study animal behavior on video and then slowing it down to see exactly what they do.
Right now, this is wrestling. This is role reversal. This is classic. Izzy could clearly nail Parker, but he trusts that Parker won't bite him and won't do anything to disturb the rules of the game. If you notice, Izzy's taking Parker's legs in his mouth. He can snap that leg off in a heartbeat, but he won't do it. Animals play, you have to look at the whole body. A wagging tail, in and of itself, may not mean anything. It may mean the animal's excited. But when you combine the wagging tail and the ears are up a bit, and the animal is walking in a very light gait and goes like that, then that's funny. Unmistakably funny. I think one of the things that people don't realize that if you want to understand animal play, is you gotta film it and you gotta watch it frame by frame, because you need the details. When you do the analysis frame by frame, you'll see that they're continually adjusting their behavior. There'll be real quick eye contact. Izzy might do something that Parker doesn't like, and Izzy will tell him to stop doing it with his eyes. You'll see that they orient so that the bites don't grab a loose lip. If you notice, they never bite the eye. They don't yank at the ears very symmetrical wrestling play. This is as good as it gets for dogs.
So I'll stop the video here so I don't, if I can figure out how to do it.
The dolphin needs to get back into the water.
Okay, so I'm going to do that. And I'm going to do that. Great. Here's an example of two wildebeest playing I shot when I was in Africa last year. So just to make the point, they can harm one another really, really fast, but they don't. They control their behavior, they negotiate the interaction. Rhinoceroses play. This is a rhinoceros looking for another animal with whom to play, just to show you diversity. Chimpanzees, elephants. And once again, elephants can harm themselves really, really easily by puncturing one another with a tusk. And I'll just slip through dogs, coyotes, just to show this is a mother with her young head in its mouth. This is pretty precarious. So I wrote an article for Ranger Rick magazine, and this will summarize my talk, because it really says what I want to say for kids. If you want to play, you ask first, by say doing a play bow. You mind your manners. If I invite you to play, I'm telling you I won't bite you too hard, I won't slam into you. You admit that you're honest. You send a play signal, it's an honest signal. Everybody will say, look, when I watch dogs play, it always turns into fighting. No, it doesn't. In fact, we've studied this in wild coyotes and wild wolves in the dog parks. Play escalates into fighting less than 1% of the time. In fact, you can watch dogs and coyotes play for years on end and never see it. We remember the attention-getting exception to the rule. Admit when you're wrong. So what we'll see is we'll see a play back, and just say I jump and I bite Celia. And that tells Celia that I'm biting her in play, not really. But if I bite her too hard and she backs off, I'll do a play bow right away to say, I'm sorry, forgive me, let's play. So we've done this statistically, believe me. I have lost 20 work study students doing the video. But the fact of the matter is, we can show with real data that the animals are using what we call this play bow, both to invite other animals to play, to precede a hard bite, and to follow a hard bite that's responded to as if it's meant to be aggressive. So these are the details that we need. We've also shown that these are facial expressions for red foxes, facial expressions for coyotes, facial expressions for wolves, tail positions in wolves. And we found in the canids, the more social animals show more nuanced facial expressions, more nuanced tail positions, and in fact, play differently. It's much more controlled. So the question that always has been asked, is there a relationship about, say, the evolution of sociality and the evolution, say, of play and emotions? And we can show now very clearly that the more social animals have more nuanced emotions. If you live in a wolf pack, there is no way you can function as a well-oiled unit without knowing what other animals are thinking and feeling. You just can't do it. They don't have the time to wonder what other animals are thinking or feeling, especially in times of danger. And once again, I've seen this in wild elephants. You just see it all the time in the field. So what does this mean? I think sometimes animals are just going, oh my goodness, we've got it, or humans have it all wrong. Another thing we get is that some people feel that giving all the attention we give to animals reduces the attention and concern that we give to humans. But I don't think this is so. I mean, I think caring about animals only increases our compassion. Some worry that granting animals the cognitive and emotional capacities to behave as moral beings makes it extremely difficult to accept who we are. And some worry that seeing animals as moral beings simply means we can't continue to treat them. And I was really pleased that the Dalai Lama wrote a blurb for my book. But the most important sentence at the end is, I firmly believe the more we care for the happiness of others, the greater our sense of well-being becomes. Saying that we don't lose anything by granting animals the emotions that they have. We're robbing them of what they have, but more importantly, I think we're robbing them of who they are in the world. And it goes against all the basic tenets of evolution. If you believe in evolution and evolutionary continuity. So just to conclude, is there a moral gap? No, I don't think there's a moral gap. There's a little support for this speciesism. There's a lot of support for Celia's position. We need to get out of the ivory tower and leave our armchairs and get into the field to see what animals actually do, and we need to leave our preconceived notions and values behind. Fully supported by our studies of cognitive ethology, the study of animal minds and social neuroscience. And this I just put in after Celia's talk, that we should look to animals to justify the horrendous human evils. And what's so special about morality? You know, I'm not sure what's so special about morality. So that's what I'm saying.
Thank you, Mark. We have about 7 minutes for Q&A.
Sorry about that, you all. Yeah.
I love the video, and but I'm concerned about malmocentrism, and this would be for both you and Celia. What about insects, the amoral world that Annie Dillard is horrified by? What about reptiles, birds, fish? Are we saying that morality is only in the mammal evolutionary sequence?
No, I don't know that it goes how far it goes. But Bernd Heinrich, who has studied ravens, has a whole chapter on moral behavior and punishing other birds for stealing food. So I don't know. I mean, frankly, I don't think you're going to find it in reptiles, but I think that's because they don't have the neural endowment necessary. I think if we want to look for this taxonomically, we should be looking at the more social mammals. That's why, like Tim Bergen, George Schaller, other people who have studied social carnivores have said, let's look to the social carnivores rather than the great apes. For example, chimpanzees, I think there is, Franz de Waal's work on bonobos and chimpanzees shows clearly about, supports the notion of inequity aversion. But I think in terms of the social behavior, we should be looking at the carnivores who have division of labor, they have dominance hierarchies both within and between the sexes as cooperative breeding, cooperative rearing. I mean, what's exciting to me, to be quite frank with you, is that work that's being done now on spotted hyenas is supporting the fact that when the young animals play, they go through this kind of thing. De Waal is showing that when chimpanzees play, they control their facial expressions to make sure that play remains the nature of the game. So I'm focusing on play because it can be misinterpreted. It's a great place to go because the animals have to agree to play. If I want to play with you, you have to agree to play with me, and it's a cooperative venture. Yeah.
I like your concentration on play because I think of play as being moral behavior in the sense that moral behavior is free behavior. You choose to enter into it, and you freely choose to follow by the rules or break the rules. You talked about moral behavior between animals, both within species and between species, and I think you at least implied, or someone did, the possibility of moral behavior between animals and human beings. I think I've seen lots of examples in my life of moral behavior between animals and human beings, with animals being the perpetrators of the moral behavior, either good moral behavior or evil moral behavior. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. Yeah. I mean, that's a quick answer, but we could talk about it. Sure, I would. Yeah.
Like an example, you mentioned elephants. I spent so little time in East Africa, and I happened to run across a couple of animal biologists while I was there, and I was fortunate to be able to spend some time with elephants. And I saw elephant behavior that to me seemed to be freely chosen behavior, both for the good and for bad, vis-a-vis human beings. Elephants intentionally choosing to go into human plantations or into human villages and wreak destruction.
Sure.
In retribution for what human beings had done to them at other places and other times. On the other hand, elephants really acting genteelly and helpfully towards human beings in situations where that would have been helpful for a human being.
Right. I mean, there's a whole new literature developing. New York Times magazine had a cover story, Are We Driving Elephants Crazy?, to show that elephants might suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. And the fact of the matter is they have a hippocampus that's larger than you would expect based on their body size. So just last fall, spindle cells were discovered in whales. It used to be thought that only spindle cells were in humans and other great apes. Spindle cells are important for emotion, intuition, rapid gut reactions. And for a long time, humanocentrists were spouting, say, Well, this all may be great, but only humans have spindle cells. It turns out if you scale the size of the whale brain into the body, like you do for humans, it turns out that whales have more spindle cells relative to brain size than humans. Anybody who's studied whales knows that. My friend trained Kiko, Free Willy. She said, you only fool a killer whale once.
One or two other questions?
Yeah.
I once heard geneticists say that the incidence of non-paternity was about 2 to 4% in humans, meaning that when they were doing transplant studies and you look at the mother and the father, it turns out the father is not the father. She also said that in birds it's the same incidence. Would that be a suggestion of morality?
Well, birds are, I mean, of the species of birds that have been studied, I think it's now considered 98% are monogamous. Is that, I think?
98%?
98 are monogamous.
That's what I mean, but of the ones that mate for life,
Yeah.
you compare the offspring with the mother and the father bird, it turns out about 2 to 4% they don't match up. The father is not the father of the bird.
Right.
And which is similar to what's in the human.
Right. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of mating systems that preclude often another male mating. But the reverse has happened. It used to be thought, until DNA fingerprinting came, that in monogamous or long-term breeding, great apes, for example, chimpanzees, it was thought that the father was the father, but it's kind of their old Kingston Trio song, the father ain't the father, but the father don't know.
Right.
And
that's the same.
yeah. One more question? Okay, well, I just invite you all to go watch animals. Thank you.
Again, we have the distinct pleasure of a biologist becoming a theologian professionally. Mark Oliver holds a PhD in biology from Emory University in Rome and has worked as a research biologist in the field of reproductive and evolutionary biology both in Europe and the United States. He is currently doing a PhD in theology with GU. Mark has been involved in our programs for a couple of years now. It's wonderful to have, as with Celia, someone with a biology PhD coming into the theological world and making that bridge professionally. So it's particularly a pleasure to have Mark. Oliver responds to Celia's birthday. Oliver, thank you.
Great thing being called Mark after that. Well, thanks, Bob. I want to thank Bob for giving me the opportunity to talk there. I was at a conference in Chicago last week. Everybody was getting up and saying, well, I want to thank you, Lawyer, and I really want to do that. But I was waiting for somebody to stand up and say, how much time did I get the chance to talk here? I'm not saying that here, but it's behavior among people at the conference. I want to start with some general remarks about evolutionary biology that I think are important for our question at hand when we talk about morality of animals. The first thing that I would like to say is that biology, like other areas like theology and also like philosophy, has trouble figuring out how to distinguish between the continuous and the distinct, or the universal and categorical. One of the best examples for that is species. In the species concept, we assume species to be the only self-defining category, naturally self-defining category in taxonomy. So we thought, you know, as long as they mate with each other and there's something that comes out of it that can mate with another member of that species or that reproductive group, then we can call it a species. Well, that is tricky. That has become very tricky. We're not really sure what a species is. We don't know whether it's really something that is anthropological or that it's ontological. Species is a very tricky category to grasp. And that exactly leads to the problem that I find here, that we cannot say where the break really is. So we have a phylogenetic continuum, we have something that we consider a species. There is something that goes on that makes this group somehow categorical, but at the same time, we have this continuum and we can't break it clear off. So how do we negotiate that, and what does that mean for things like the evolution of morality and certain complex social behaviors? Now, species have been called the phenomenon of reproductive biology, of sex, sexual reproduction. I think there's a lot to be said about that, but again, all I want to point out is that we have a continuum that is really hard to deal with. Now, we find Celia, I thought, gave a beautiful introduction here on some of the really tricky questions to deal with in evolutionary biology. So if we assume this this continuum find, then how do we deal with behaviors that are really hard to explain? I mean, if we say that self-interest in animals should be important because it's adaptive, how do we deal with behaviors that are not apparently not coming out of self-interest? So altruism was mentioned here, and I'd like to give a definition that Robert Trivers gives for altruism. He calls it behavior that benefits another organism, closely related, and that's actually fairly important, while being apparently detrimental to the organism performing the behavior. And detrimental here means that it is costly in terms of my own reproduction. So my evolutionary success of reproducing would be diminished by that. This is really hard to explain for evolutionary biologists. I mean, how do you explain this? So some people have gone into this and have said, well, we can actually look at it as, we have a mother taking care of its child. Well, that's very easy. I mean, they're genetically related. They're sharing their own genes. Well, that's a very genocentric point of view, and as Celia has also pointed out, that's very tricky to deal with because it just does not work that way. Genes are often thought still in very deterministic ways of something that produces the phenotype. So we have a genotype that determines the phenotype. That's not how it goes. The genotype really, and I know even the evolutionary biologist, and there's one in the room, and we often have this discussion, but I strongly believe that's a too simplistic view of how that works. I think that the genotype actually gives you, if you want, a norm of reaction, a phenotypic plasticity, which then determines the phenotype. So in other words, the genes interact with the environment to produce a phenotype. So it's a way more complex system than we initially thought. And that also leads to one of the points that Mark showed in Tinbergen's four aspects of behavioral biology, and that is development. Development is very complex, and there's interaction with the environment. Now, I think when we then talk about these very strange behaviors like empathy or sympathy, or do animals have a theory of mind, altruism, how can we talk about these behaviors in animals? Are they there, or have they evolved in humans, or have humans just developed them as epiphenomena? That's something that comes out of social behavior that we kind of created. All these theories float around, and I think what is important here is with what kind of philosophical presupposition you go into this discussion. And there are two ways of going into this, I believe. One is cognitive parsimony, and the other one would be an evolutionary parsimony. So cognitive parsimony would hold that behaviors must not be explained by higher mental capacities that can be equally easily explained by lower mental capacities. So you have an animal that does something that looks to us like intentional behavior towards another that is altruistic. You could say, well, that's just conditioned behavior. It's something they learned, it's classically conditioned, nothing to it. That would be one way. And this is a point of view that is often argued as from biologists that Celia was pointing out earlier, that have a very genocentric approach to this and see selfish behavior as something that is always directed to maintaining your own genetic lineage. Evolutionary parsimony, on the other hand, would look at these behaviors and would say that there is a phylogenetic continuum, and that the underlying mental processes of the same behaviors in closely related species are therefore probably the same. So if we see an empathetic behavior in human beings, and we see a similar behavior, say, in a chimpanzee, since the underlying neural substrates are similar, since the social behavior and the social context is similar, why would we assume that it is not empathy? And so this train of school would actually suggest that these behaviors have evolved. Now, I think, and I don't want to put words into Celia's mouth, but I would say that the way that I read her paper and heard her paper today also is that she actually falls into the second category, and assumes the evolutionary parsimony, that these behaviors can actually evolve. And that brings me now directly after these introductory words on evolutionary biology, directly to the paper. I think that I would have to agree with a lot of things that Celia said. I thought it was a wonderful paper. There are some minor points that I felt slightly uncomfortable with, and one of them was the idea of animal morality being latent. And let me explain why that is. It's less that, as far as I understand Celia, she would agree that when we speak of evolution of morality and moral behavior, it does not mean that our morality grew out of chimpanzee morality. However, if they are really moral, as she says in her paper, and if their morality has to be seen in the context of their own group of their species, then I'm not exactly sure why we have to think of it as latent. It could be thought of as moral in its own right, fully moral in its own right. Of course, not applying our categories, as she said very nicely. We cannot bring our understanding of morality to their morality, but I think it's full morality. So in that way, I think that the term latent could perhaps be a little bit misleading. Also, I think it could suggest, and again, I mean, it could suggest to this, what could lead to this misconception that morality and as we see it in animals, kind of evolved further in what we have. And this latency leading to something more would be an intrinsic, would suggest at least for me, an intrinsic advancement in the process which is not there. I know that Celia's not saying that, but that's why I feel a little uneasy with that term, because it might suggest that and could lead to misunderstandings. There's less a criticism of what you were saying about the thing as such as the wording that I found a little tricky there. The next question that I thought was interesting is the question, when we think about latent morality, does that mean they have not full morality? Is human morality more than theirs? And I wonder if perhaps Celia was talking about the ability of animals to sin. She seemed, if I understand her correctly, she seemed a little suspicious of that. Primarily because sinning would include the ability to turn away from God. But to turn away from God, you have to, it seems, know God or have experience that you somehow equate or bring into connection with something that you refer to as God or the difference in being. So in other words, we could rephrase this a little bit and say, could animals have a relationship with God? And this, of course, is tricky. I mean, a relationship with God, can we assign that to animals? We don't have a problem with that with human beings, we would do that with animals. Now, I think that one of the first things that we would have to find here is self-consciousness in that. So we have to have a being, an animal, an individual that is able to reflect upon its own situation, its own the experience that it has in its own world. And then that's, of course, difficult to test. How can we talk about something like self-consciousness in animals? I mean, that's notoriously difficult to study, I would say. And I would agree that it's difficult, but I don't think it's impossible. For one thing, I think Mark was absolutely right, that we have to allow for a certain anthropomorphism, or let's say our perspective, when we study that. But there are certain ways of how we can test that. There's the mirror self-recognition tests that are being done in numerous animals. Now, the idea here is that if an animal looks at itself in a mirror and can somehow make the connection between itself and that mirror image, that there is a cognitive step that is different from just looking at the mirror and thinking this is an opponent or this is another animal. So there is something that works there. And these tests are being done, and then you put a mirror in front of an animal, the animal looks at it, and then starts, after a while, actually to investigate itself. That was what people saw first, actually. Wolfgang Krüller saw it in the 1920s, and it was in the 1970s that Gordon Gallup actually did the first studies in that way. Animals will look at the insides of their mouth and so forth, and will start to investigate themselves. The idea here is that the animal then makes the connection. This is me, this is not somebody else, this is not something else. Now, what people do then is they mark the body parts of these animals with marks, and those could only be seen if the animal looks into the mirror and could make the connection. Okay, when I'm seeing in the mirror this mark here over my eye, this must be me, and they start scratching it, they start smelling their fingers, they start to get it off. And they have actually shown in numerous animals that this is actually exactly what happens. And I have a video that just came out a little while ago, and if you're interested, I can show you them in the break, of elephants that do that too. So elephants have actually mirror self-recognition. Now, that points to self-awareness, and now, of course, it's a little bit of a leap to go from self-awareness to self-consciousness. I get that. But there are some people who say that since self-consciousness would assume that would require some form of symbolic representation, and that symbolic representation does not have to be language that's we use. It could be actually pictures, and in fact there are some forms of autism where people think in pictures. So there is the possibility that animals could actually do that without having the complex language that we have with syntax and all that kind of stuff. In fact, animals that were taught sign language sign often to themselves. So chimpanzees taught, or gorillas taught sign language, will sign to themselves. Some people interpret that as a form of speaking out loud to themselves. And they suggest that there could be something like a reflection upon their own experiences, which I would really willingly call self-consciousness. So if there's self-consciousness, I think there could be actually the possibility of knowing on and reflecting upon one's experiences. I mean, Mark showed this picture of this chimpanzee and Gandhi that sits by the waterfall, and we talked about this last night over dinner. There's this sense of awe. These elements look at natural events, and they don't behave naturally, quote unquote, what we as biologists would call natural behavior that is directed biologically interesting and important behavior. They show a display that cannot be described anything else but awe. They sometimes start to vocalize very strangely. They show behavior that they seem to be captivated by the scene, and they show behavior that is not really related to anything that we know would be a function, be approximate and ultimate. So if we allow for this awe to be, I'm just going to be stepping out here a little bit and call this a proto-religious experience, just for discussion's sake. If we allow for this to be a proto-religious experience, can we then say that they actually have to know God in order to turn away from God? Well, I'm going to, again, this is a little bit speculative, but I just want to put it out and see where we can go with this. But I think if we consider Paul, Romans 2:13-15, where he talks about Gentiles, not animals, so that's wrong, but what he says, and I quote here, where it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous in God's sight, but the doers of the law who will be justified. The Gentiles who do not possess the law instinctively, what the law requires, these, though not having the law, are law to themselves. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, to which their own conscience also bears witness. Okay, well, let's dissect this just a little bit in order to see why I find this maybe a helpful approach here for us as theologians. The two words that stand out is instinctively and conscience. And for Paul, and coming from the context of a Hellenistic philosophy at the time, I'm sure that we can turn to Philo and Alexander to get a little bit of a taste of what he maybe, how Paul would have interpreted these terms. And instinctively, or by nature, out of their own nature, meant that individuals can act as it is their nature. So if they act actually good by the law, out of their nature, and this law is written on their heart, it's not that they have to know God in order to act righteously. Secondly, their conscience bears witness, and conscience here was often understood as self-conscious, as consciousness. So again, what I would like to say is, it seems what Paul suggests is you have to have consciousness, and you have to have something that is acting by your own nature, and then you might actually be able to know God, or to act, not know Him as but act according to the law, and that is as it is understood that God wants us to act. Well, if that's the case, I think animals could perhaps also turn away from that. And Celia mentioned the work that the observations that we have from chimpanzees, where they go to war with each other, and where they actually do not act in a way that is, or in a way that we would call moral, where they act immoral. So where they act out evil. Now, another point that, and I just want to make two more points, but then we can move on. But, another point that Celia made was she talked about evolutionary suffering and how we as theologians have to deal with the question of evolutionary suffering because it would be a form of evil. I'm not exactly sure that I want to agree with that. I'm not sure that all suffering has to be evil. And this is of course a big debate, I think, but I really do not think that suffering necessarily has to be evil. Suffering can actually lead to growth. And so we know this from our own experiences in our lives. I think unless we have, in many cases, suffering will bring us to a point of growth that we otherwise would not get to. So what I'm trying to say is that we don't necessarily have to think of suffering always as evil. And that brings me then to my last point that I want to make here in response to her paper, and that's the concept of anthropogenic evil. And that's a concept I really have a hard time wrapping my head around. I'm not exactly sure what to do with this concept. I applaud Celia's point that we need to come to terms with our deeds towards nature and how that causes suffering in nature. What I'm not entirely sure about is if we actually do this knowingly, I mean, she mentioned how we treat the environment and how we cause environmental damage. I mean, most of us do this actually knowing full well that this is a bad thing and that we cause suffering. In that case, I would think of it as moral evil. If we do it not knowingly, then it would be, in a way, to me at least, not very different from the same kind of natural evil that we get from other species. So there's anthropogenic evil, but then there could also be bacteriogenic evil, for example. I mean, every species in the world has an impact on nature. It has an impact on other species. So my question would be, how is anthropogenic evil different from, say, bacteriogenic or any other species evil that can be brought upon nature, just as a matter of being within the evolutionary continuum? I think I'll leave it there, and then we can see what it is.
We have about 10 minutes of questions. So if you want to come first,
I mean, I don't know whether it's appropriate to respond to some of these at the end of the day, or whether to do it now. I think the first point to be raised about moral latency, I'll just mention. I don't want to hog the whole discussion tonight, but we can hear. Okay, so stand up. Mentioned the idea of moral latency. I wasn't happy with whether that was different from morality, genuine morality animals. I do actually make a distinction in my paper that I'm not sure you've picked up sufficiently, where I do say that there is a form of morality in animals which is within their own worlds. I'm using latency in the sense of what you've described as evolutionary parsing. In other words, there is a sense in which there's a continuum between different species. So I'm not using it in a condescending sense, which is what you seem to be implying. I'm using it in the sense as just as our level of consciousness and our level of intelligence could be said to be different from that of apes, but also in continuity with it. So there's a sense in which our moral sphere is both in continuity but different. So I want to respect animals in their own worlds. I'm not in any way implying by using the word latency that we are superior. I'm just saying that there is a development there in much the same way as you can't say that humans are, say, less intelligent. So in some sense, our moral capacities or our capacity for good and ill or evil is actually greater than you find in other species. We're the most destructive species on Earth. And so that's the first point. The second point about the possibility of religion and sin in animals and so on. I hadn't come across the slides that Mark showed, or his discussion on awe and wonder before I wrote the paper. I may want to revise some of that, but I think it's an area that needs more research. So I would say I want to know more from the biologists first before I'm prepared to speculate, perhaps to the extent that you are happy to speculate. So I would say I'm open about that option. But I think there is a difference between the experience of wonder, which also atheists have, such as Richard Dawkins and others. They have had experience of wonder, they've experienced the transcendent, but they don't have what they recognise as a belief, as a sort of relationship with God, but they come close. And I would say that perhaps animals come close. They have this sort of sense of the transcendent, but I'm not sure what that actually means. So I'm a little bit more cautious about using the word sin, because I think the way sin has been defined tends to be related to our known relationship with God. But I think that the boundaries are blurry there. So those are just two of the points I'd like to pick up from you. But I do think that you were right, that we need to be open about different possibilities in animals. And so I'd like to thank you for some of those comments. But I did want to sort of highlight the moral latency issue, sure, because I don't think quite I think you maybe misunderstood what I was trying to say.
No, I mean, I was very, very aware that you said they have morals in their own world. Yeah. It's not that I thought that the concept of latency was wrong. I just thought that the word really misleading. In other words, that when you tell people who are not familiar with evolutionary biology that it's latent, that there could be a quick thought, or there could be the wrong connection. So it was more a warning, yeah, of using that term from my perspective. rather than not random.
Mark?
I just wanted to point out that whenever I go to meetings like this, people talk about the chimpanzee wars, but let's be clear that Jane Goodall only saw this once over the last 47 years. Once.
Yeah.
And it's not been seen in any other time. And the only reason I point that out, because until she saw that after 15 years of her field work, she had a really different picture of the chimpanzees. But in her book, Reason for Hope, and other places, she makes it really clear that she thinks that one difference in kind, if you will, not difference in degree, could be the capacity for evil in humans. I want to stress that because it's like remembering the one time that a wolf fight, a play broke into fighting, and all of a sudden, when animals play, they're really cheating. Richard Dawkins, of course, has gone to town on this, but Richard doesn't ever watch animals anymore, so what does he know? Well, no, seriously.
To respond to that, I think that's a very good point. The reason why I think nonetheless it's a helpful example is that we had a fission of a group, and we had actually one group annihilate the other.
Yes.
And they came from one group before.
Right.
So it was. I like to see it as a breakdown of those social rules of engagement.
I do agree there. Yeah.
So, Janice?
This is maybe how do evolutionary biologists explain man's inhumanity to man in terms of that being part of the natural? Like we have people killing each other every day now in Iraq. How do they explain that in terms of evolutionary thought? Because you would think that goes against, killing your species isn't helping the species do.
Well, it would depend what perspective of evolutionary biology you have, but I think most evolutionary biologists would respond to that by saying, well, you just had, at the end, you put in the slight misunderstanding probably, the saving of the species. They would say, it's not about the species, it's about saving the lineage, your genetic lineage. And so by that, you can actually perfectly well explain why there would be selfish behavior and have.
So the Shiites just want to keep the Shiites going and the Sunnis
so
want
to speak, yeah.
So
So it would be then that we have, when we speak of, and this is the other thing that often is kind of confused when Richard Dawkins speaks of selfish genes. He acknowledges that it is not the same selfishness as we have when we talk about human behavior and being selfish. Of course, then one could wonder why he did not use a different term, but at any rate, we have true, in that sense, we have selfishness. We can be selfish and do something evil to others for our own benefit, and I think that is certainly within our capabilities, and more would be one of those examples. Moreover, I think that many times this proper behavior between individuals can break down. We can learn to overwrite our empathy or others.
Okay, let's thank Oliver. So we're going to take a break for lunch. Those of you who are registered, there are some box lunch for you. If you didn't have a chance to register, there are restaurants on 2nd Avenue. You can get a quick sandwich or whatever you like. Let's come back in 1 hour. It'll be 20 minutes to 2. It'll be 10 minutes behind our schedule.